Chapter 1. The Weight of Service. Staff Sergeant Timothy Fletcher adjusted his tactical vest one last time before stepping out of the armored vehicle. The Afghan sun beat down mercilessly on Forward Operating Base Warrior, a name that seemed increasingly ironic with each passing day of his third deployment. At 32, Tim had spent more time in war zones than in his own home, a fact that gnawed at him every time he video called his wife May and their twin 8-year-old daughters, Emma and Sophie. Tim's journey to this dusty outpost had begun in rural Ohio, where he'd grown up on his father's failing farm. The military had offered him purpose, structure, and a way to provide for the family he'd dreamed of having. May Moyer had been the prettiest girl in their high school class, with auburn hair and green eyes that could stop traffic. They'd married 2 weeks after graduation, both 19 and full of dreams about their future together. Those dreams had sustained Tim through his first deployment to Iraq, where he'd earned his first Purple Heart after an IED explosion left him with shrapnel scars across his left shoulder. May had been there for his recovery, patient and loving, even when the nightmares kept them both awake. The second deployment to Afghanistan had been harder. The twins had just turned 5, and leaving them had felt like tearing his heart out. But this third deployment was different. May's calls had become shorter, less frequent. When they did talk, she seemed distracted, distant. Tim attributed it to the stress of single parenting, the burden of keeping their household running while he was half a world away. He'd promised himself this would be his last deployment. After 12 years of service, he was ready to come home and be the husband and father his family deserved. Fletcher, Sergeant Jacob Kellogg called out, jogging across the compound. Jake had been Tim's squad mate for 2 years, a tough kid from Detroit who'd joined the Army to escape the streets. Despite being 5 years younger, Jake had become Tim's closest friend in the unit. Got a minute? Tim nodded, following Jake to a quiet corner behind the communications tent. Jake's usual easy smile was replaced by a serious expression that immediately put Tim on alert. Look, man, I don't know how to say this, Jake began, running his hand through his short black hair. My cousin Corinne, she's a paralegal back home in Detroit. She called me yesterday. She's been helping her boss with some divorce cases, and Jake trailed off, clearly struggling. What is it, Jake? Tim's voice was steady, but his stomach had already begun churning. She saw May at the courthouse last week. With some guy? They were filing paperwork together, looking real cozy. Jake's words hit Tim like a physical blow. Corinne did some digging, professional curiosity, she said. The guy's name is Edwin Brock. He's some hotshot real estate developer, drives a BMW, lives in that fancy new subdivision outside town. Tim felt the world tilt slightly. May had mentioned meeting a helpful neighbor who'd fixed their fence while Tim was away, someone named Ed. But a real estate developer? At the courthouse? Maybe it's nothing, Jake continued, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. Maybe she was just getting legal advice or something. But Corinne said they looked close. Really close. Tim stared out at the desert landscape, his mind racing. May's recent distance suddenly took on a different meaning. The shortened calls, the way she'd started mentioning this Ed character more frequently, always in the context of how helpful he was being. Tim had been grateful someone was looking out for his family. Now that gratitude curdled into something darker. Thanks for telling me, Tim said finally. I need to make a call. That evening, Tim sat in the cramped communication booth, waiting for May to answer. When her face appeared on the screen, he studied it with new eyes. She looked different. Her hair was styled differently, and she was wearing makeup despite it being a casual evening at home. Hey, honey, May said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. How was your day? Same old. Kids asleep? Yeah, they went down about an hour ago. Ed helped them with their math homework earlier. You know how they struggle with fractions. There it was again. Ed. Tim kept his expression neutral. That's nice of him. Remind me, what does Ed do for work? May's eyes flickered almost imperceptibly. Oh, he's in construction. Builds houses and stuff. Not real estate development. Construction. A small lie, but a lie nonetheless. Tim felt something cold settle in his chest. Listen, May, I've been thinking about when I get back. Maybe we should take that trip to the cabin we've been talking about. Just the 4 of us, no distractions. That sounds nice, May replied, but her enthusiasm seemed forced. We can talk about it when you get home. After they hung up, Tim sat in the darkness for a long time. 12 years of marriage, 2 beautiful daughters, a lifetime of shared dreams and promises. If Jake's cousin was right, if May was seeing Edwin Brock, then everything Tim had fought for, bled for, was crumbling while he was thousands of miles away, unable to protect what mattered most. But Tim Fletcher hadn't survived 3 combat deployments by being naive or passive. If someone was threatening his family, his marriage, then they'd picked the wrong soldier to cross. Tim had resources, skills, and a network of contacts that most people couldn't imagine. If May was betraying him, if this Edwin Brock thought he could waltz into Tim's life and steal his family, they were about to learn a very expensive lesson. Tim pulled out his secure phone and started making calls. By morning, he'd know everything there was to know about Edwin Brock, and he'd have a plan. Because in Tim's world, intelligence was the difference between victory and defeat, and he intended to win. Chapter 2. The Breaking Point. 3 weeks after Jake's revelation, Tim had compiled a comprehensive dossier on Edwin Brock. What he'd learned made his blood run cold. Edwin wasn't just some opportunistic neighbor. He was a calculating predator who specialized in targeting military wives during deployments. Corinne Jordan, Jake's cousin, had proven invaluable in gathering intelligence. Her legal connections had revealed Edwin's pattern. 3 previous relationships with deployed soldiers' wives, each ending with the soldier returning to find his family gone and his finances in ruins. Edwin Brock was 38, divorced, and wealthy from a series of questionable real estate deals that skirted the edge of legality. He drove a black BMW, owned a 5,000-square-foot house in Willowbrook Estates, and had a reputation for charm and generosity that masked a ruthless core. Most disturbing of all, he'd been seen frequently with May and the twins, taking them to expensive restaurants and amusement parks, playing the role of devoted stepfather while Tim was dodging bullets in Afghanistan. Tim's investigation had also revealed troubling financial activity. May had opened new credit cards and a separate bank account, all without mentioning them during their calls. Significant purchases had been made, jewelry, clothes, furniture, far beyond what their military salary could support. Edwin's money was already flowing into Tim's household, buying his wife's affections and his daughter's loyalty. The confirmation of his worst fears came on a Tuesday morning. Tim was reviewing patrol routes when his satellite phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Corinne. Attached were photos taken the previous evening. May and Edwin entering a hotel together, holding hands, kissing in the elevator. His wife of 12 years, the mother of his children, the woman who'd promised to wait for him, was living a double life. Tim stared at the images until they burned into his memory, then methodically deleted them. His hands were steady, his breathing controlled, but inside, something fundamental had broken. The last vestiges of hope died, replaced by a cold, calculating fury that would have terrified anyone who knew him well. That afternoon, Tim requested emergency leave to handle a family crisis. His commanding officer, Colonel Martinez, approved it immediately. Tim's record was exemplary, and he'd never asked for anything before. But Tim wasn't going home to reconcile. He was going home to end this, permanently and completely. Tim's flight landed at Cincinnati International Airport on a gray October morning. He'd been gone for 8 months, and everything about his hometown felt foreign. Corinne Jordan met him at the airport, a sharp-featured woman in her late 20s with intelligent brown eyes and an expression that suggested she'd seen too much of the world's ugliness through her legal work. "I'm sorry, Tim," she said as they walked to her car. "I know this isn't what you wanted to hear." "It's what I needed to hear," Tim replied. "Show me everything." During the drive to his house, Corinne briefed him on the latest developments. May had been telling neighbors that Tim was considering leaving the military early. She'd also been seen house hunting with Edwin in more expensive neighborhoods, suggesting they were planning a future together. "There's something else," Corinne said as they pulled into Tim's driveway. "Edwin has a history of violence. His first wife filed restraining orders, and there were domestic assault charges that somehow disappeared. He's not just a homewrecker, he's dangerous." Tim studied his house with new eyes. The lawn was perfectly manicured, too perfect for May to have maintained alone. New furniture was visible through the front windows. His home had been transformed into something unrecognizable, colonized by another man's presence and money. May's car wasn't in the driveway, and the house was empty. Tim entered through the back door, using his key for what he suspected would be the last time. Inside, the changes were even more dramatic. Expensive electronics, new artwork, furniture that cost more than Tim made in 6 months. Edwin had bought his family's affections and made his territory unmistakable. In the master bedroom, Tim found evidence of Edwin's presence. Men's clothing in his closet, cologne on his dresser, photos of Edwin with May and the twins displayed where Tim's military awards used to sit. His marriage was over, his children's affections had been purchased, and his life's work had been erased by a man with deeper pockets and fewer scruples. Tim methodically photographed everything, documenting the evidence of May's betrayal and Edwin's invasion of his home. Then he sat on the bed he'd once shared with his wife and composed the most important message he'd ever written. At 3:47 p.m., Tim's phone buzzed with a text from May. Deployment extended again. Won't be home until March. Kids understand. Ed's been great helping out. Tim stared at the message, recognizing it for what it was. May's attempt to buy more time with her lover while keeping Tim safely deployed and unaware. She had no idea he was sitting in their bedroom, surrounded by evidence of her betrayal. His response was simple. Understood. Take care of the girls. Tim spent the next 6 hours in his house, planning every detail of what would come next. By evening, he'd made a series of phone calls to old contacts, transferred funds from accounts May didn't know about, and set in motion a plan that would destroy Edwin Brock's life as thoroughly as Edwin had destroyed his. The next morning, Tim drove to Emma and Sophie's school. He watched from across the street as his daughters got out of Edwin's BMW, laughing at something he'd said. Edwin walked them to the door, ruffling their hair like a loving father. The sight should have broken Tim's heart, but his heart was beyond breaking now. All that remained was cold, methodical purpose. That evening, May returned home to find Tim sitting at the kitchen table, still in his desert camouflage uniform. Her face went white, and she dropped her purse, keys scattering across the floor. Tim, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be deployed until. Sit down, May. She sat, her hands trembling. Tim studied his wife's face, memorizing the moment when her carefully constructed lies began to crumble. I know about Edwin, Tim said simply. May's composure shattered completely. Tears streamed down her face as she began a stream of excuses and justifications. She was lonely. Edwin was kind. She never meant for it to happen. She still loved him, but things had changed. All the predictable words of someone caught in an unforgivable betrayal. Tim listened without emotion until she finished. Then he leaned forward slightly. May, I want you to call Edwin and tell him to come over. Tonight. We're going to settle this like adults. Tim, please, I can explain. Call him. Now. May's hands shook as she dialed Edwin's number. Tim watched her face as she spoke, seeing the exact moment when Edwin agreed to come over, probably expecting to finally confront the deployed husband and claim his prize openly. Edwin Brock had no idea what was waiting for him, but he would learn, very soon, that some soldiers are far more dangerous when they come home than when they leave. Chapter 3. Intelligence Gathering. Edwin Brock arrived at the Fletcher house 45 minutes later, driving his black BMW with the confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. Tim watched through the front window as Edwin checked his appearance in the rearview mirror, adjusted his expensive suit jacket, and strode up the walkway like he owned the place. In his mind, he probably did. Tim opened the door before Edwin could knock. Edwin Brock was exactly what Tim had expected, tall, artificially tanned, with perfectly styled graying hair and a smile that belonged on a campaign poster. His handshake was firm and practiced, the grip of someone who'd built a career on appearing trustworthy while being anything but. You must be Timothy, Edwin said, his tone carrying just enough deference to seem respectful while maintaining an undertone of superiority. May's told me so much about you. Thank you for your service. Please, come in, Tim replied, his voice neutral. May's in the kitchen. Can I get you something to drink? Coffee would be great, if it's not too much trouble. Tim led Edwin to the living room, noting how the other man's eyes swept over the space possessively. Edwin settled into the new leather armchair, his leather armchair, with the ease of someone completely at home. May entered carrying a coffee tray, her hands still shaking slightly. So, Edwin began, crossing his legs and accepting his coffee. This is an unusual situation. May and I weren't expecting you back so soon. Emergency leave, Tim said, settling onto the couch across from Edwin. Family crisis. Edwin's smile faltered slightly. Nothing serious, I hope. That depends on your perspective. Tim sipped his coffee, studying Edwin over the rim. May tells me you've been very helpful while I've been deployed. Fixing the fence, helping with homework, taking the family out for dinner. Just being neighborly, Edwin replied, but there was something in his eyes now. Wariness, calculation. May and the girls are wonderful. You're a lucky man. I am, Tim agreed. 12 years of marriage, 2 beautiful daughters. A man would have to be insane to risk losing something like that, don't you think? The question hung in the air like a blade. Edwin's practiced smile remained in place, but Tim could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. This wasn't going the way Edwin had expected. May, Tim said without taking his eyes off Edwin. Would you check on the girls? Make sure they're asleep? May hesitated, clearly wanting to stay for whatever was about to happen, but Tim's tone brooked no argument. She left, closing the kitchen door behind her. Now we can talk honestly, Tim said. Man to man. Edwin leaned back in his chair, his confidence returning. Look, Timothy, I like you. You seem like a good guy, a real patriot. But May and I have developed feelings for each other. These things happen. She's been alone for months at a time, and 3 times, Tim interrupted. Excuse me. You've done this 3 times before. Military wives whose husbands were deployed. Jessica Martinez in Fort Hood, her husband was in Iraq. Linda Patterson at Camp Pendleton, her husband was in Afghanistan. Sarah Kim at Norfolk, her husband was on a carrier in the Pacific. Edwin's face went pale, but he maintained his composure. I don't know what you're talking about. Tim pulled out his phone and began reading from his notes. Jessica Martinez, married to Captain Roberto Martinez. You started dating her 4 months into his deployment, moved her and her son into a rental property you owned. When Roberto came home, he found divorce papers and an eviction notice. Jessica and her son moved to California with you, but you dumped them 3 weeks later. Roberto had a nervous breakdown, left the service, and now works security at a mall. Edwin's hands were clenched now, his knuckles white. Linda Patterson, married to Sergeant First Class David Patterson. Same pattern, isolation, expensive gifts, playing daddy to her 2 daughters. David came home to find his bank accounts emptied and his family gone. He tried to fight for custody, but you'd already moved Linda and the girls to Nevada. David started drinking, lost his rank, and got discharged. He's homeless now, living on the streets of San Diego. You don't understand the complexities, Edwin began. Sarah Kim, Tim continued relentlessly, married to Petty Officer First Class Michael Kim. You were particularly cruel to that one. Not only did you steal his wife and daughter, but you also got him transferred to a worse duty station by claiming he was harassing you. Michael tried to commit suicide twice before his shipmates intervened. He's in therapy now, but he'll never fully recover. Edwin stood abruptly, his facade finally cracking. Those relationships ended naturally. People grow apart. I gave those women happiness when their husbands couldn't. Tim remained seated, perfectly calm. You're a predator, Edwin. You target vulnerable women whose husbands are deployed, you isolate them from their support systems, and you use your money and fake charm to steal their affections. Then, when the husbands come home broken and destroyed, you move on to your next victim. You can't prove any of that. Tim smiled for the first time since Edwin had arrived, and it was not a pleasant expression. Actually, I can. See, I've spent the last 3 weeks doing what I do best, gathering intelligence. I've talked to all 3 of your previous victims. I have documentation of your financial manipulation, your pattern of behavior, and your history of domestic violence. Edwin's composed mask slipped completely, revealing the ugly reality underneath. You think you're so smart, soldier boy? You think May gives a damn about your heroic service? She told me everything about your nightmares, your drinking, your emotional distance. You were a shitty husband long before I came along. Maybe, Tim acknowledged, but I was trying to be better. You, on the other hand, never tried to be anything but a parasite. Edwin stepped toward Tim, his face flushed with anger. May chose me. The girls love me. I can give them things you never could, security, comfort, a father who's actually present. You bought their affections with money you made destroying other families, Tim said, finally standing. Though Edwin was taller, Tim's military bearing and obvious physical conditioning made him seem larger, more dangerous. But that ends now. What are you going to do? Edwin sneered. Hit me? Assault me in front of your wife and children? Go ahead. I'll own your house and your pension by the end of the week. Tim's smile widened. I'm not going to hit you, Edwin. I'm going to do something much worse. I'm going to tell you exactly what's going to happen to your life, starting tomorrow morning. Edwin laughed, but it sounded forced. You're delusional. May and I are in love. We're planning a future together. You're just an obstacle to remove. May, Tim called, his voice carrying clearly to the kitchen. Would you come back in here, please? And bring the girls. Tim, no, May said as she returned, her face ashen. Don't involve the children in this. They're already involved, Tim replied. Edwin made sure of that. Emma and Sophie appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleepy eyes. They were beautiful children, with May's auburn hair and Tim's strong jaw. When they saw Edwin, their faces lit up with genuine affection that cut Tim deeper than any blade. Ed, Sophie ran to Edwin, who picked her up and held her close. Are you staying for breakfast? We'll see, sweetheart, Edwin said, his voice gentle in a way that would have been convincing if Tim didn't know what lay beneath the surface. Emma hugged Edwin as well, and Tim watched his daughters shower affection on a man who saw them only as tools for manipulation. But he also noticed something else. The way Edwin's eyes hardened when the girls weren't looking, the calculating expression that flickered across his face when he thought no one was watching. Girls, Tim said, kneeling to their level. I need you to go back to your room for a little while. The adults need to finish talking. But Daddy, Emma protested, we haven't seen you in so long. I know, sweetheart. We'll have all day tomorrow to catch up, I promise. After the girls reluctantly went back to their room, Tim turned to Edwin with an expression that would have warned a smarter man to run. Last chance, Tim said quietly. Walk away now. Disappear from their lives completely. Move to another state. Find some other target. Do that, and this ends here. Edwin's response was to put his arm around May's waist possessively. May has already chosen. Haven't you, darling? May looked between the two men, and Tim saw the exact moment when she made her final choice. I'm sorry, Tim. I do love Edwin. We want to be together. Tim nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already known. Then God help you both, because what's coming next is going to destroy everything you think you've built together. Edwin laughed again, but this time there was an edge of uncertainty in it. Big words from a broken-down soldier. What are you going to do exactly? Tim pulled out his phone and speed-dialed a number. Jake? Yeah, it's time. Execute Phase 1. He hung up and looked at Edwin with eyes that had seen combat and death and worse things than either man could imagine. Edwin Brock, Tim said formally. Tomorrow morning at exactly 9 a.m., your life is going to start falling apart. By the end of the week, you'll have nothing left. And by the end of the month, you'll be begging me for mercy. You're insane, Edwin said, but his voice had lost its confident edge. Maybe, Tim replied, but I'm also very, very good at what I do. Chapter 4, The First Strike. At precisely 8:47 a.m. the next morning, Edwin Brock's phone began ringing. He was having breakfast with May and the twins at the country club, playing the part of the devoted new family man. The caller ID showed his assistant's number. Edwin Brock, he answered, maintaining his charming smile for May's benefit. Mr. Brock, his assistant's voice was strained, we have a problem. The zoning department just arrived with a cease and desist order for the Willowbrook Phase 2 project. They're saying our permits were fraudulently obtained. Edwin's fork paused halfway to his mouth. That's impossible. I personally handled those permits 6 months ago. Sir, they have documentation showing that 3 of the wetland surveys were falsified. The EPA is opening an investigation, and the city is threatening to revoke all our current permits pending a full audit. Edwin excused himself from the table, walking quickly toward the club's lobby where he could speak freely. Listen to me carefully. Call Morrison at the zoning office. Remind him of our golf game last month and the donation I made to his campaign fund. This goes away today. I tried, sir. Morrison says he's never met you and doesn't play golf. He seemed genuinely confused when I mentioned the donation. A chill ran down Edwin's spine. The Willowbrook project was his flagship development, worth $30 million. If the permits were revoked, he'd face massive penalties and potential criminal charges. Get our lawyer on the phone. Now. 20 minutes later, Edwin was pacing in his BMW in the country club parking lot, listening to his attorney explain the impossible. Edwin, I've reviewed the documentation. The permits you showed me 6 months ago? According to the city records, they never existed. The signatures are forgeries, and the surveyors listed claim they never worked on your project. That's insane, Edwin shouted. I have copies of everything in my office safe. Then we need to see those copies immediately. If we can prove the city made an error. No, Edwin interrupted, his mind racing. Something was very wrong here. He thought about Tim Fletcher's calm confidence the night before, his cryptic threats about Edwin's life falling apart. I need to go to the office first. I'll call you back. Edwin drove to his office building with growing dread. His company, Brock Development, occupied the entire third floor of a gleaming downtown tower. But when he arrived, he found his employees gathered in confused clusters, holding boxes of personal belongings. What's going on? Edwin demanded. His secretary, Jeanette Dawson, looked up with red-rimmed eyes. Mr. Brock, building security came 2 hours ago. They said our lease was terminated for non-payment, and we had to be out by noon. Non-payment. Edwin's voice cracked. I personally signed the check for this quarter's rent 3 weeks ago. Jeanette handed him a letter from the building management company. According to their records, Brock Development hadn't paid rent in 6 months and owed over $180,000 in back payments plus penalties. They'd attempted to contact Edwin multiple times, but he'd failed to respond. Edwin stared at the letter, his hands shaking. This is impossible. Check my accounts. The payments went through. But when Edwin called his bank, the news got worse. Much worse. Mr. Brock, the bank manager said in a carefully neutral tone, I'm afraid there's been some unusual activity on your accounts. We need you to come in immediately to discuss some irregularities. Edwin drove to the bank in a panic, his mind reeling. At the bank, he was ushered into a private office where 2 managers and a security officer waited. The lead manager, a stern woman named Patricia O'Neill, slid a stack of documents across the desk. Mr. Brock, according to our records, you've been moving money between accounts in a pattern consistent with money laundering. Large cash deposits from unknown sources, immediate transfers to offshore accounts, structured withdrawals designed to avoid federal reporting requirements. Edwin stared at the bank statements in disbelief. The transactions were real, documented in black and white, but he'd never made them. This isn't possible. I would never. Someone's framed me. That's for the authorities to determine, Patricia replied. We're required to file a suspicious activity report with FinCEN, and we've frozen all your accounts pending investigation. You can't do that. I have payroll to meet, contractors to pay. I'm sorry, but federal law requires us to cooperate with law enforcement in cases of suspected financial crimes. Edwin stumbled out of the bank in a daze. In less than 4 hours, his business had been destroyed, his accounts frozen, and he was facing potential federal charges. As he sat in his BMW in the parking lot, trying to process what was happening, his phone rang again. Edwin. May's voice was worried. Where are you? Mrs. Henderson called. She said there were men at our house taking pictures and measurements. Edwin's blood turned to ice. What kind of men? She said they looked official. They had clipboards and cameras, and they were very interested in the addition you had built onto the house. Edwin closed his eyes, remembering the unpermitted addition he'd built to impress May. A beautiful sunroom that had cost $40,000 and had been constructed without proper permits or inspections. He'd assured May it was all legal, but he'd cut corners to save money and speed up construction. I'm coming home, he said. But when Edwin arrived at his house, he found city inspectors crawling over the property like ants. A stern-faced man in a hard hat approached him. Are you Edwin Brock, the property owner? Yes, what's the problem? Sir, we've received a complaint about unpermitted construction on this property. Our initial inspection shows multiple code violations, including electrical work done without permits, improper foundation work, and structural modifications that don't meet current safety standards. The inspector handed Edwin a thick stack of citations. You have 48 hours to hire a licensed contractor to bring everything up to code, or we'll be forced to condemn the structure as unsafe for habitation. Edwin scanned the citations, his vision blurring. The estimated cost of bringing everything up to code was over $100,000, money he no longer had access to. There must be some mistake, Edwin said weakly. No mistake, sir. We also found evidence of asbestos in the older part of the structure and possible lead paint contamination. You'll need environmental remediation before any work can begin. As the inspectors continued their work, Edwin's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Strike 1. You have 72 hours to disappear, or strike 2 will be much worse. TF. Edwin stared at the message, finally understanding the scope of what he was facing. Timothy Fletcher hadn't been making empty threats. Somehow, impossibly, the soldier had orchestrated a coordinated attack on every aspect of Edwin's life. But Edwin hadn't built his fortune by backing down from fights. He'd destroyed 3 military families already, and he wasn't about to be intimidated by a 4th. If Timothy Fletcher wanted war, Edwin would give him one. Edwin made a call to Keith Ryan, a private investigator he'd used before for less than legal purposes. Keith was ex-military himself, discharged for reasons he never discussed, and he had no moral qualms about the jobs Edwin hired him for. Keith, I need you to dig up everything you can on Staff Sergeant Timothy Fletcher, currently deployed in Afghanistan. I want his service record, his financial situation, any skeletons in his closet. I want enough dirt to bury him. How deep do you want me to dig? Keith's gravelly voice suggested he was capable of digging very deep indeed. All the way to hell if necessary. And Keith, I need this fast. 24 hours. Edwin hung up and looked back at his house, where the inspectors were photographing every violation. May stood in the doorway, holding the twins, her face pale with shock and confusion. Timothy Fletcher had drawn first blood, but Edwin Brock was far from finished. The soldier thought he was smart, but he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd left Edwin alive and functional. That oversight was going to cost him everything. Chapter 5, Counterattack. Keith Ryan called Edwin at 6 a.m. the next morning with news that made Edwin's blood sing with vindictive joy. I found something big, Keith said without preamble. Your boy Fletcher isn't the war hero he pretends to be. Edwin, who had spent the night in a hotel after his house was declared temporarily uninhabitable, sat up in bed. What do you have? 2 years ago, Fletcher's unit was involved in a civilian casualty incident in Afghanistan. An airstrike hit a school that was supposed to be empty. 12 kids died. Fletcher was the forward observer who called in the coordinates. Edwin's pulse quickened. Was he charged? Officially? No. The investigation concluded it was bad intelligence, not Fletcher's fault. But I found the real story. Fletcher had been drinking before the mission. Several witnesses saw him, but they were ordered to keep quiet. The coordinates he called in were off by 200 meters. Those kids died because your war hero was drunk on duty. Jesus, how did this get covered up? Military politics. Fletcher's commanding officer, Colonel Martinez, was being considered for promotion. A friendly fire incident would have ended his career, so he buried the investigation and transferred the witnesses to different units. Edwin smiled for the first time in 24 hours. Can you prove this? I've got photos, witness statements, and Fletcher's own after-action report where he admits to spatial disorientation during the mission. I also found something else. Fletcher's been receiving psychiatric treatment for PTSD and has been on medication for anger management issues. This was perfect. Edwin could destroy Fletcher's reputation, his military career, and his credibility in the divorce proceedings that were surely coming. May would be horrified to learn that her husband was responsible for the deaths of children, and the twins would never look at their father the same way again. Send me everything, Edwin ordered. And Keith, find out where May Fletcher is staying. I need to have a conversation with her. May was at her sister's house across town, having taken the girls there when the house was condemned. Edwin arrived with flowers and his most sincere expression, ready to play the role of the supportive partner during a difficult time. Jeanette Carey, May's younger sister, answered the door with obvious reluctance. Edwin, I don't think this is a good time. Please, Edwin said, his voice heavy with emotion. May and the girls mean everything to me. I just want to make sure they're okay. May appeared behind her sister, her eyes red from crying. Edwin, what's happening? The bank called and said your accounts were frozen. The house is condemned. I don't understand any of this. Edwin took May's hands, projecting wounded sincerity. Someone is trying to destroy us, May. Your husband has come back from war and decided he wants revenge. He's using his military contacts to sabotage everything we've built together. Tim wouldn't do that, May said, but her voice lacked conviction. Wouldn't he? Edwin pulled out his phone and showed May the documentation Keith had provided. Did you know your husband was drunk when he called in an airstrike that killed 12 children? Did you know he's been seeing a military psychiatrist for violent tendencies? May stared at the documents, her face going white. This can't be real. It's all real. Tim Fletcher isn't the hero you married, May. He's a broken man who's turned his military training against anyone who threatens his control over you and the girls. Edwin watched May process the information, seeing the exact moment when doubt crept into her eyes. The Tim I married would never hurt innocent people. War changes men, Edwin said gently. Sometimes they come back as monsters. I'm trying to protect you and the girls, but I need you to be strong. Will you stand with me? May nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. What do we do? First, we go to the police. Your husband has committed multiple felonies in his campaign against us. Then we file for an emergency custody order to keep him away from Emma and Sophie until he gets the psychiatric help he clearly needs. Edwin spent the next hour coaching May on what to tell the police, carefully crafting a narrative that painted Tim as an unstable veteran who'd snapped under pressure. May's statement would describe threatening phone calls, suspicious activity around their house, and her growing fear that Tim might hurt their children. By afternoon, Edwin and May were sitting in the police station, filing a formal complaint against Timothy Fletcher. The detective, a middle-aged man named Sergeant Gene Foley, listened to their story with professional skepticism. Let me understand this, Foley said. You believe Staff Sergeant Fletcher, who's currently on emergency leave, has somehow manipulated federal agencies to freeze your assets and convince city inspectors to condemn your house. I know how it sounds, Edwin replied, but Fletcher has specialized training in psychological warfare. He's using those skills against civilians now. Foley looked through Keith's documentation about the Afghanistan incident. This is serious stuff, but it's also military jurisdiction. Even if it's true, I can't arrest a soldier for actions taken in a combat zone. What about the financial crimes? Edwin pressed. The fraudulent bank transactions, the permit violations? We'll investigate, Foley said. But if Fletcher is responsible, he's been very careful not to leave evidence linking him to the crimes. Edwin felt his frustration building. So he can destroy our lives and you can't touch him? I didn't say that. Foley leaned back in his chair. If Fletcher is harassing you, making threats, or engaging in stalking behavior, that's something we can act on. Have you seen him since your confrontation 2 nights ago? May spoke up. He called this morning. He said Edwin had 48 hours to disappear or things would get worse. Edwin nodded. He's escalating. I'm afraid for May and the children's safety. Foley made notes. We can issue a restraining order based on the threatening communications. If Fletcher violates it, we can arrest him immediately. As they left the police station, Edwin felt a surge of confidence. The restraining order would limit Tim's access to his own children, and the investigation would keep him occupied defending himself instead of attacking Edwin. Meanwhile, Keith was working on finding more damaging information about Fletcher's military record. But Edwin's confidence evaporated when they arrived back at May's sister's house to find 2 unmarked sedans parked outside. Men in dark suits were interviewing the neighbors, and one of them approached Edwin as he got out of his car. Mr. Edwin Brock. The man flashed a badge. Special Agent Luther Boyer, FBI. We need to speak with you about some financial irregularities in your business accounts. Edwin's heart sank. The FBI meant federal charges, serious prison time if convicted. I think I need my lawyer. That's your right, Boyer replied. But we're going to have this conversation one way or another. The question is whether you want to cooperate or make this harder on yourself. As Edwin was led to one of the sedans for questioning, his phone buzzed with another message from Timothy Fletcher. Strike 2. Last warning. TF. Edwin looked back at May, who was watching from the porch with growing terror. He'd underestimated Timothy Fletcher badly. The soldier wasn't just dangerous. He was connected, resourceful, and absolutely ruthless. Edwin's counterattack had failed, and now he was facing federal prison time. But Edwin had one card left to play, and it was the cruelest one imaginable. If Timothy Fletcher wanted to destroy him, Edwin would make sure the cost was higher than the soldier could bear. He would target the one thing Fletcher cared about most, his daughters. As the FBI sedan pulled away, Edwin was already planning his final, desperate gambit. If he was going down, he'd take Timothy Fletcher's family with him. Chapter 6. The Trap Springs. The FBI interrogation lasted 14 hours, but Edwin's expensive lawyers had trained him well. He said nothing, admitting to nothing, and demanded every piece of evidence be formally presented. When Agent Boyer finally released him at 3 a.m., Edwin had learned two crucial things. The evidence against him was ironclad, and it had been compiled with military precision. Someone with intimate knowledge of both federal banking regulations and intelligence gathering techniques had methodically constructed a perfect financial crimes case against him. Every fraudulent transaction had been documented, every forged permit photographed, every illegal payment traced. Timothy Fletcher had allies in very high places. Edwin's lawyer, Clarence Ho, met him outside the federal building with grim news. "They have enough to put you away for 20 years, Edwin. Money laundering, fraud, conspiracy, racketeering, they're throwing everything at you. What are my options? Cooperate. Give them information about your other business dealings, testify against your partners, and maybe we can get you 5 to 7 years instead of 20. Edwin stared at the empty downtown streets, his mind racing. 5 to 7 years meant losing everything. His business, his reputation, and most importantly, May and the twins. He'd be a convicted felon by the time he got out, unemployable and broken. There has to be another way. Clarence shook his head. Fletcher played this perfectly. Whoever helped him knew exactly which laws you'd broken and how to document them. This isn't harassment, it's a professional takedown. Edwin's phone buzzed with a call from Keith Ryan. "I've got Fletcher's location," Keith said. "He's at a motel outside town, room 237. And Edwin? He's alone. His family doesn't know where he is." An idea began forming in Edwin's mind. Desperate, dangerous, but possibly his only chance for survival. "Keith, I need you to do something for me. Something that requires absolute discretion." "How discretal are we talking?" "The kind that never happened." There was a pause. "That'll cost extra. Money's no object. I need you to grab Fletcher tonight. Quietly. Bring him somewhere we can have a private conversation." "You're talking about kidnapping a federal witness, Edwin. That's life without parole territory." "He's not a federal witness. He's the one who set me up. And I'm not talking about kidnapping. I just want to have a conversation somewhere he can't run to his FBI friends." Another pause. "Where do you want this conversation to happen?" Edwin thought about the abandoned warehouse he owned on the outskirts of town, a building that wasn't connected to any of his legitimate businesses. "I'll send you the address. And Keith, bring the equipment we discussed last year." Keith had been an interrogation specialist in the Army before his discharge, and he'd mentioned several times that he still had access to certain tools of the trade. Edwin had never imagined he'd need those services, but desperate times called for desperate measures. At 4:47 a.m., Keith called with confirmation. "Package delivered." "But Edwin, this guy isn't going to break easy. He's had resistance training." Edwin drove to the warehouse with his pulse pounding. This was the biggest gamble of his life. If he was caught, he'd spend the rest of his life in federal prison. But if he could extract the right information from Timothy Fletcher, he might be able to turn the tables. The warehouse was dark and cold, with Tim Fletcher zip-tied to a metal chair in the center of the empty space. Keith had done his work professionally. Fletcher was unconscious but uninjured, and there were no witnesses to how he'd gotten there. When Fletcher woke up, his first reaction wasn't fear or confusion. He looked around calmly, assessed his situation, and then focused on Edwin with eyes that held no emotion at all. "This is a mistake," Fletcher said quietly. "The mistake was thinking I'd go down without a fight," Edwin replied, pulling up a second chair. "You've cost me everything, Fletcher. My business, my reputation, the woman I love. But you made one crucial error." Fletcher waited. "You left me functional long enough to strike back. Now we're going to have a conversation about how this ends. What do you want?" Edwin pulled out his phone and showed Fletcher a photograph Keith had taken earlier, May and the twins entering a shopping mall, unaware they were being watched. "I want you to call your FBI friends and tell them you made a mistake. The evidence against me was fabricated. You'll recant everything and disappear back to Afghanistan." Fletcher stared at the photo for a long moment. "And if I don't, then May and the girls are going to have a very unfortunate accident. Car crashes happen all the time, especially during rainy weather." For the first time, Fletcher's composure cracked slightly. "You're threatening children. I'm offering you a choice. Your pride or their lives." Fletcher was quiet for almost a minute, and Edwin could see him thinking, calculating, planning. Finally, he spoke. "Keith Ryan, discharged from the army for assaulting a superior officer. Currently works as an unlicensed private investigator and specializes in corporate espionage. He's standing behind me right now, probably armed. Edwin felt a chill. Fletcher shouldn't have known Keith's name. This warehouse is owned by Edwin Brock Development through a shell company registered in Delaware, Fletcher continued. The shell company was created to hide assets from federal investigators and hasn't been reported on your tax returns. Keith drove here in a stolen car he's used for 3 previous kidnappings, and his fingerprints are all over the motel room where you had him grab me. Edwin's mouth went dry. How do you? Because I've been planning this conversation for a week, Fletcher said calmly. Did you really think I'd come back to Ohio without preparing for every contingency? The warehouse lights suddenly blazed to life, and Edwin spun around to see FBI agents pouring through every entrance. Agent Boyer was among them, weapon drawn, shouting commands. Edwin Brock, Keith Ryan, you're under arrest for kidnapping, conspiracy, and making terrorist threats. As the agents swarmed them, Fletcher looked at Edwin with something that might have been pity. The children were never in danger, he said. The photo Keith showed you was taken by FBI surveillance teams who've been protecting my family since the day I got back. May and the girls are safe, and they always were. Edwin felt his legs give out as the handcuffs clicked into place. He'd walked into a perfect trap, one that had been designed specifically to make him destroy himself. Fletcher had never lost control of the situation. He'd simply allowed Edwin to think he had. You set this up, Edwin gasped. All of it. You wanted me to kidnap you. Fletcher nodded as the FBI agents helped him out of his restraints. You're a predator, Edwin. But you're also predictable. When cornered, predators always go after the weakest targets. I just made sure that when you reached for my children, you grabbed federal agents instead. As Edwin was led away in chains, he heard Fletcher making a phone call. May, it's over. You and the girls can come home now. Edwin Brock's war against Timothy Fletcher was finished, and he'd never had a chance to win. The soldier had outplanned, outmaneuvered, and outfought him at every turn. Edwin's last coherent thought before the FBI van doors closed was that he should have taken Fletcher's original offer to disappear. Now it was too late for mercy. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. 3 days after Edwin's arrest, Timothy Fletcher sat in the living room of his restored home, watching Emma and Sophie play in the backyard through the window he'd fixed that morning. The house had been cleared by the city inspectors once the fraudulent violations were exposed, and May had moved back in with the children. But nothing between Tim and May had been truly settled. May entered carrying 2 cups of coffee, her movements cautious and uncertain. She'd barely spoken to Tim since learning the full scope of what he'd done to Edwin, and the weight of her betrayal hung between them like a physical barrier. The girls seem happy to be home, May said, settling onto the couch with careful distance between them. They're resilient, Tim replied. Kids adapt better than adults. May stared into her coffee. The FBI agent, Boyer, he told me Edwin won't be getting bail. The kidnapping charge alone is enough to keep him locked up until trial. Tim nodded but said nothing. Edwin Brock was facing a minimum of 40 years in federal prison, and with his history of targeting military families, he wouldn't survive 5. Keith Ryan had already agreed to testify against Edwin in exchange for a lighter sentence, providing details about Edwin's previous schemes and the methods he'd used to destroy other military families. Tim, May said quietly, I need to understand something. How long have you known about Edwin and me? 3 weeks. May's face crumpled slightly. And you planned all of this in 3 weeks? Most of it, yes. The rest was contingency planning. The financial crimes, the permit violations, the FBI investigation. You orchestrated all of that. Tim turned to face his wife directly. Edwin Brock was a career criminal who specialized in targeting military families. The financial crimes were real. I just made sure the FBI found evidence of them. The permit violations were real. I just made sure city inspectors knew where to look. Everything I did was legal, May. I just used the system more effectively than Edwin thought possible. May shook her head in amazement and horror. You destroyed his entire life. He destroyed 3 military families before ours, and he would have destroyed more after us. I stopped a predator. By becoming one yourself. Tim considered that. Maybe. But Edwin targeted innocent families. I targeted someone who'd earned what he got. May stood and walked to the window, looking out at their daughters. What about us, Tim? Where does this leave us? Tim had been dreading this conversation, but knew it was inevitable. That depends on you. Do you love him? May was quiet for a long time. I thought I did. But after seeing what he was capable of, learning about his history, I don't know what was real and what was manipulation. That's not an answer, May. I know. May turned back to face him, tears in her eyes. Tim, I betrayed you. I betrayed our marriage, our family. I told him things about you that I should never have shared with anyone. I let him buy our children's affections while you were risking your life for our country. Yes, you did. May flinched at his blunt honesty. Can you forgive me? Tim studied his wife's face, seeing the woman he'd fallen in love with 16 years ago, but also recognizing the stranger she'd become during his deployment. I can forgive you, May, but I can't forget, and I can't trust you. Then what are we supposed to do? I don't know, but I do know that Emma and Sophie deserve better than parents who stay together out of obligation or guilt. They need to see what a healthy relationship looks like, even if that means their parents aren't together. May sat back down, her shoulders slumping. You want a divorce. I want honesty. From both of us. If we stay married, it has to be because we both choose to rebuild what we had, not because we're afraid of the alternative. And May, rebuilding means you have to be willing to do the work. Counseling, transparency, whatever it takes to earn back trust. And if I'm not willing, then we end this as amicably as possible for the girl's sake, and we both try to find happiness somewhere else. May nodded slowly. I hurt you so badly, Tim. I don't know if I can ever make it right. Maybe you can't. But the only way to find out is to try. Before May could respond, the doorbell rang. Tim answered it to find Corinne Jordan standing on the porch with a briefcase and a serious expression. We need to talk, Corinne said without preamble. Both of you. In the living room, Corinne opened her briefcase and pulled out several legal documents. Edwin's lawyers are claiming he was entrapped. They're saying Tim used illegal surveillance and manipulation to trick Edwin into committing crimes. Tim felt a flicker of concern. Can they make it stick? Probably not, but they're going to try. They're also threatening to file civil suits against Tim for damages to Edwin's business and reputation. May looked confused, but Edwin was guilty of everything they charged him with. Legally, yes, Corinne explained. But Edwin's lawyers are arguing that he never would have committed the kidnapping if Tim hadn't manipulated him into it. They're painting Tim as the real predator. Tim wasn't surprised. Expensive lawyers were trained to create reasonable doubt regardless of their client's obvious guilt. What do we need to do? Corinne smiled grimly. Actually, nothing. While Edwin's lawyers were crafting their entrapment defense, I was documenting Edwin's previous crimes. Jessica Martinez, Linda Patterson, and Sarah Kim have all agreed to testify about Edwin's pattern of behavior. The prosecution is adding additional charges based on their testimony. She pulled out photographs showing Edwin with his previous victims, along with financial records documenting his systematic destruction of military families. Edwin Brock isn't just facing charges for what he did to your family. He's looking at federal racketeering charges for operating what amounts to a criminal enterprise targeting deployed service members. May stared at the photos. He did this to other families? 3 that we can prove, possibly more. Edwin specifically targeted military wives during deployments, used the same methods each time, and left the families destroyed when he moved on to his next victims. Tim felt a grim satisfaction. Edwin's lawyers had tried to portray their client as the victim, but the evidence showed him to be exactly what Tim had known him to be, a predator who'd built his lifestyle on the suffering of military families. There's something else, Corinne continued. Keith Ryan has been very cooperative since his arrest. He's provided detailed information about Edwin's methods, including the psychological manipulation techniques Edwin used to target vulnerable women. May's face went pale. Psychological manipulation? Edwin had profiles on military wives in the area, Corinne explained gently. He researched their situations, their vulnerabilities, their children's needs. Everything he did with you was calculated and deliberate. May look like she might be sick. The fence repair, the help with homework, the expensive dinners. All part of a practiced routine he'd used successfully 3 times before. Tim watched his wife process the revelation that her affair hadn't been a spontaneous emotional connection, but a carefully orchestrated manipulation. Part of him felt vindicated. May hadn't chosen Edwin over him so much as she'd been expertly targeted and groomed by a career criminal. But another part of Tim felt sad for May. realizing that her betrayal had been born not from a lack of love for their marriage, but from loneliness and vulnerability that Edwin had exploited with professional skill. So what happens now? May asked quietly. Corinne closed her briefcase. Edwin pleads guilty to all federal charges and serves his time quietly, or he goes to trial and gets exposed as a serial predator who targeted military families for years. Either way, he's going away for the rest of his life. After Corinne left, Tim and May sat in silence for a long time, each processing what they'd learned. Finally, May spoke. Tim, I'm so sorry. I thought I was making a choice for love, but I was just being manipulated by a criminal. Does knowing that change how you feel? May thought about it. It changes how I feel about Edwin, but it doesn't change what I did to you, to us, to our family. Tim nodded. That was the right answer, the beginning of real honesty between them. May, I'm going to ask you one more time. Do you want to save our marriage? May looked out at Emma and Sophie, who were chasing fireflies in the gathering dusk. Yes, but only if you think it's worth saving. Tim considered the question seriously. May had betrayed him, but she'd also been victimized by a predator. Their marriage had problems before Edwin appeared, but those problems weren't insurmountable. And despite everything that had happened, Tim still loved his wife. It's worth saving, he said finally. But May, this can never happen again. If you're unhappy, if you're lonely, if you need something from me that you're not getting, we talk about it. We fight about it if necessary. But we don't bring other people into our marriage. Never again, May promised. Tim, I want to go to counseling. I want to understand how I became vulnerable to someone like Edwin so it never happens again. Tim pulled May close for the first time since he'd returned home, feeling some of the tension leave his shoulders. They had a long road ahead of them, but for the first time since this nightmare began, he believed they might make it. Outside, Emma and Sophie called out that they'd caught 3 fireflies. Tim and May went out to admire their daughter's prizes, and for a moment, they felt like a family again. But Tim knew that Edwin Brock's final gambit was still to come. Men like Edwin didn't go quietly, and even from prison, he might find ways to strike back. Tim would need to stay vigilant, because the war wasn't over until Edwin was completely defeated. Chapter 8, Final Confrontation. 6 months after Edwin's arrest, Tim received an unexpected call from Corinne Jordan. Edwin was requesting a face-to-face meeting before his sentencing, claiming he had information that could affect Tim's family's safety. Against his better judgment, Tim agreed to meet Edwin at the federal detention facility, curious about what final card the man might try to play. Edwin looked haggard in his orange jumpsuit, his carefully maintained appearance replaced by the hollow look of a man who'd lost everything. When he entered the visitor's room, his eyes held none of their former confidence, only desperate cunning. Thank you for coming, Edwin said as he sat across from Tim, separated by reinforced glass. What do you want, Edwin? Edwin leaned forward. I want you to know that destroying me won't protect your family forever. I'm not the only one who preys on military wives. There's a whole network of men who share information, techniques, target lists. Tim remained impassive. Is that a threat? It's a warning. I kept detailed files on every family I targeted, vulnerabilities, financial information, children's schools, and activities. Those files are insurance policies. Where are these files? Edwin smiled coldly. Safe. And if anything happens to me in prison, they get distributed to some very unpleasant people. People who won't be as gentle with your family as I was. Tim studied Edwin's face, recognizing the desperation behind the bravado. You're lying. If you had that kind of insurance, you would have used it months ago to cut a deal with the FBI. Edwin's composure cracked slightly. You don't know everything, Fletcher. You think you're so smart, but you missed something crucial. What did I miss? Your wife isn't the only one I was working on. I had backup targets, other military families. While you were focused on protecting May and the girls, I was cultivating relationships with other vulnerable women. Tim felt a chill. Who? Edwin's smile returned. Sarah Mitchell, wife of Captain James Mitchell, currently deployed in Syria. Lovely woman, 2 teenage sons. I've been very supportive during her husband's absence. Tim recognized the name. James Mitchell was a friend from his first deployment, a good soldier and devoted family man. You're lying. Am I? Check her social media. Look at the photos from the charity fundraiser 3 weeks ago. See who's standing next to her, helping her serve dinner to other military families. Edwin pulled out a contraband cell phone. How he'd gotten it, Tim didn't want to know, and showed Tim a Facebook photo. There was Sarah Mitchell, arm in arm with a man Tim didn't recognize, but who had Edwin's predatory smile. Meet Donald Brock, my younger brother. He's been running the same game I perfected, and he learned from watching my mistakes with your family. Tim's blood ran cold. While he'd been destroying Edwin, another predator had been targeting his friend's family using refined versions of Edwin's techniques. What do you want? Tim asked. I want you to call the FBI and recant your testimony. Tell them I was entrapped, that you fabricated evidence. Give me a lighter sentence, and I'll call off my brother. And if I don't, Edwin's eyes glittered with malice. Then Sarah Mitchell gets the full treatment. Donald will destroy her marriage, take her children, and move on to the next target. He's already identified 6 potential victims in military communities across 3 states. Tim sat back, mind racing. Edwin was cornered and desperate, but that made him more dangerous, not less. Even from prison, he could cause tremendous damage through his brother or other accomplices. I need proof that your brother will stop if I cooperate. Edwin made a call on his contraband phone. After a brief conversation, he handed the phone to Tim through the slot in the glass partition. Timothy Fletcher? The voice was similar to Edwin's, but younger, smoother. My brother tells me you're a reasonable man. Where's Sarah Mitchell right now? Safe at home with her boys. She has no idea she's being targeted. But that could change very quickly if we don't reach an understanding. Tim made a decision that went against every instinct he'd developed in 12 years of military service. I'll need time to consider this. 24 hours. Edwin said as Tim handed back the phone. After that, Donald accelerates his timeline with the Mitchell family. Tim left the prison with his mind churning. Edwin's desperation had revealed a larger network of predators targeting military families, something that went far beyond Tim's personal vendetta. But it also presented an opportunity if Tim was careful. Instead of going home, Tim drove directly to the FBI field office and requested an immediate meeting with Agent Boyer. Within an hour, he was sitting in a secure conference room with Boyer and 3 other federal agents. Edwin Brock is trying to extort me into recanting my testimony, Tim began, and explained the entire conversation, including the threat against the Mitchell family. Agent Boyer leaned forward. Did you get the brother's phone number when he called? Yes. Tim provided the number along with everything else Edwin had told him. We can trace that number, identify Donald Brock's location and associates, Boyer said. But we need you to play along with Edwin's demands long enough for us to build a case against the brother. How long? 72 hours, maybe less. We need you to convince Edwin that you're considering his offer while we gather evidence against Donald and identify the other targets. Tim nodded. This was exactly the kind of complex operation his military training had prepared him for, using an enemy's desperation against them while protecting innocent victims. The next morning, Tim returned to the prison for another meeting with Edwin. This time, the conversation was recorded by FBI surveillance equipment. I've thought about your offer, Tim said, but I need guarantees. How do I know your brother won't just find new targets after I help you? Edwin looked relieved. Donald isn't like me. He's in this for the money, not the thrill. Give him enough cash to disappear, and he'll move to another country and find easier ways to make a living. How much cash? $2 million. Untraceable, delivered to an offshore account. Tim pretended to consider it. That's a lot of money for a soldier's salary. But not for a soldier with access to his wife's inheritance, Edwin said smugly. May's grandmother left her quite a nest egg before you deployed, didn't she? She just never mentioned it because she was saving it as a surprise for your retirement. Tim felt another piece click into place. Edwin's financial intelligence on Tim's family was far more detailed than he'd suspected, suggesting a level of surveillance and preparation that bordered on obsessive. I'll need to verify that the money is available and figure out how to transfer it without triggering federal monitoring. Edwin's eyes lit up with greed and hope. I can help with that. I know people who specialize in moving money discreetly. Over the next 2 days, Tim continued playing along with Edwin's extortion scheme, while the FBI traced Donald Brock's location and identified his network of accomplices. What they found was even worse than Tim had imagined. A coordinated group of predators who shared intelligence on military families, traded techniques for psychological manipulation, and maintained detailed databases on potential victims. Donald Brock wasn't just targeting Sarah Mitchell. He was simultaneously working on 3 other military wives while recruiting new accomplices in different states. The network Edwin had created was a criminal enterprise that had destroyed dozens of military families over several years. On the third day, Agent Boyer called Tim with news that made his blood sing with vindictive satisfaction. "We got them all," Boyer said. Donald Brock, his 3 current targets, and 7 other men in 4 states who were part of the network. "We're charging them with conspiracy, racketeering, wire fraud, and a dozen other federal crimes." "What about the families they were targeting?" "Safe. We intercepted all of them before any real damage was done. Sarah Mitchell has been briefed and is taking steps to protect herself and her sons." That afternoon, Tim returned to the prison for his final meeting with Edwin. When Edwin entered the visitor's room, Tim could see in his face that he already knew his plan had failed. "Your brother was arrested this morning," Tim said without preamble, "along with his entire network." Edwin slumped in his chair, finally understanding that he'd been outmaneuvered one last time. "You were never going to help me. I was never going to let you hurt another military family. But you gave me something better than revenge, Edwin. You gave me the entire network." Edwin looked up with eyes full of hatred and defeat. "This isn't over, Fletcher." "Yes, it is." Tim stood to leave. "You're going to spend the rest of your life in federal prison. Your brother and his friends are going to join you. And the families you targeted are safe." Tim paused at the door. "Edwin, I want you to know something. Every night for the rest of your life, when you're lying on your prison cot, remember that you could have walked away. I gave you that chance, and you chose to fight instead. Everything that happened to you after that was a choice you made." Edwin said nothing as Tim left, but his expression was that of a man who finally understood the scope of his defeat. Outside the prison, Tim called May to let her know it was truly over. Then he called James Mitchell to check on Sarah and her boys. Finally, he called Agent Boyer to volunteer for a new FBI task force focused on protecting military families from predators like Edwin. Tim Fletcher had gone to war to protect his family and had ended up protecting dozens of families he'd never met. It wasn't the ending he'd expected when he came home from deployment, but it was the one he could live with. Chapter 9, New Beginnings. 1 year after Edwin Brock's sentencing to life in federal prison, Tim Fletcher stood at his kitchen window watching Emma and Sophie play in the backyard with their new puppy, a golden retriever they'd named Courage. May was in the garden, planting flowers for the spring, humming softly to herself as she worked. It was a scene of domestic tranquility that would have seemed impossible during the dark months of Edwin's manipulation. Tim's phone rang, interrupting his peaceful morning. Agent Boyer's name appeared on the screen. "Fletcher, we got him." Tim didn't need to ask who. For 6 months, the FBI's Military Family Protection Task Force, which Tim had helped establish, had been tracking a new predator who'd been targeting Navy families on the West Coast. Gustavo Cohen had been smart enough to learn from Edwin's mistakes, but not smart enough to stay completely invisible. How? Same as always. He got greedy and tried to work multiple targets simultaneously. One of the wives got suspicious when she saw him at another woman's child soccer game, claiming to be that woman's boyfriend too. Tim smiled grimly. Predators like Edwin and Gustavo could never resist the temptation to expand their operations, and that greed inevitably led to mistakes that exposed them. "That makes 12, Tim said, referring to the number of predators the task force had identified and arrested in the past year. 12 networks dismantled, 43 arrests, and over 200 military families protected, Boyer corrected. "Tim, I know you've been thinking about making this work permanent." Tim had been considering Boyer's offer to join the FBI as a special agent focused on crimes against military families. His unique combination of military experience and personal knowledge of these predators' methods made him invaluable to the investigation process. "I'm still thinking about it." "Think faster. We've got credible intelligence about a network operating out of Texas that's bigger than anything we've seen. We need you on this." After Boyer hung up, Tim sat at his kitchen table and considered his options. The Army had offered him a promotion and assignment to the Pentagon, which would mean staying in the military but working in Washington instead of deploying. The FBI wanted him to become a special agent focused on protecting military families. And May had suggested he could leave government service entirely and use his skills in the private sector. All 3 options had merit, but only one felt like a calling. May entered the kitchen, her hands dirty from gardening, and poured herself a cup of coffee. Their marriage had survived the trauma of Edwin's manipulation, but it had required months of counseling, complete financial transparency, and rebuilt trust through small daily choices. They were stronger now than they'd ever been, but it had taken significant work from both of them. Boyer again? May asked, noting Tim's expression. They want me to join the task force permanently. May sat across from him, studying his face. What do you want to do? I want to protect military families. What Edwin did to us, what his network was doing to dozens of other families, it's still happening. There are more predators out there, and they're getting smarter. But it would mean traveling frequently, working undercover operations, potentially putting our family at risk if we go after the wrong people. May reached across the table and took his hand. Tim, for 12 years you've served our country by fighting foreign enemies. Maybe it's time you served our country by fighting domestic ones. You'd be okay with that? The travel, the danger, the uncertainty. May smiled. I'd be proud of it. And our girls need to see that their father stands up for people who can't protect themselves. That afternoon, Tim called Boyer and accepted the FBI's offer. His military career was ending, but his service to military families was just beginning. 2 months later, Special Agent Timothy Fletcher graduated from the FBI Academy at Quantico with the highest marks in his class. His first assignment was the Texas network Boyer had mentioned, a sophisticated operation that had been targeting military families across the Southwest for over 3 years. The investigation took 6 months and resulted in the arrest of 15 predators and the protection of 47 military families. Tim's military experience and understanding of these criminals' psychology proved invaluable in building cases that put them away for decades. But the most satisfying moment came during the final arrests, when Tim personally served the warrant on the network's leader, a man named Reuben A. Baer who had refined Edwin's techniques and was training other predators to target military families. You have no idea what you're dealing with, Reuben said as Tim cuffed him. This network is bigger than you can imagine. Then we'll imagine bigger, Tim replied. Over the next 2 years, Tim became the FBI's leading expert on crimes against military families. He developed training programs for military family readiness groups, created protocols for identifying and investigating predators, and personally participated in operations that dismantled criminal networks in 12 states. May supported his work completely, even when it required him to travel frequently or work undercover operations that lasted weeks. She'd started her own support group for military spouses who'd been targeted by predators, helping them rebuild their lives and recognize the warning signs of manipulation. Emma and Sophie, now 11 years old, were proud of their father's work and completely unaware of how close they'd come to losing their family to Edwin's manipulation. They knew their dad had helped put bad people in jail, and that was enough for them. On a quiet evening in December, 3 years after Edwin's arrest, Tim sat in his home office reviewing case files when May brought him a cup of coffee and the day's mail. Among the letters was one with a familiar return address, the federal prison where Edwin Brock was serving his life sentence. Tim opened the letter with curiosity. Edwin's handwriting was shakier than before, and his words carried the weight of a broken man. Fletcher, I know you'll never forgive me for what I did to your family, and I'm not asking for forgiveness. But I want you to know that I've been following your work with the FBI through news reports. You've destroyed networks I didn't even know existed. You've saved families I would have targeted if I'd been free. I spent my life destroying military families, and you've spent yours protecting them. I suppose there's a kind of justice in that. I have terminal cancer and won't live to see next Christmas. When I'm gone, the world will be a better place. But it's already better because of the work you're doing. E. Brock. Tim stared at the letter for a long time, feeling not satisfaction or vindication, but something closer to sadness. Edwin Brock had been a predator and a destroyer of families, but he'd also been a human being who'd chosen a path that led inevitably to his own destruction. Tim folded the letter and filed it away. Edwin's acknowledgement didn't change what he'd done or make up for the pain he'd caused, but it served as a reminder of why Tim's new work was so important. 6 months later, Edwin Brock died in prison, alone and unmourned. Tim didn't attend the funeral, there wasn't one. Edwin's body was buried in an unmarked grave at the prison cemetery, the final anonymity of a man who'd built his life on deception. But Tim's work continued. By his 5th year with the FBI, he'd been promoted to supervisory special agent, and was leading a national task force that had identified and dismantled over 30 criminal networks targeting military families. The work was challenging, often dangerous, and frequently heartbreaking, but it was also deeply satisfying. On Memorial Day weekend, Tim sat on his back porch watching Emma and Sophie, now teenagers, help May with a barbecue for military families from the local base. Corinne Jordan was there with her new husband, a Marine officer she'd met through one of Tim's cases. Agent Boyer had brought his family, as had several other FBI agents who worked military family protection cases. It was a gathering of people who understood the sacrifices military service required and the importance of protecting those who served. Tim looked around at the faces of families who were safe because of the work his task force had done and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. May approached with a beer and sat beside him. Thinking about anything important? Just grateful, Tim replied. 3 years ago, I thought my life was over. My marriage was destroyed, my family was broken, and I was consumed with anger and the need for revenge. And now I get to wake up every morning knowing that the work I do protects military families from predators. I get to come home to a wife who loves me and daughters who are proud of their father. And I get to know that Edwin Brock's legacy isn't the families he destroyed, but the system we built to prevent others like him from succeeding. May leaned against Tim's shoulder. I'm proud of you, and I'm proud of us for surviving everything that happened. Tim kissed the top of May's head, smelling the familiar scent of her shampoo and feeling the solid reality of her presence. We didn't just survive, May. We became stronger. As the sun set over their backyard full of friends and colleagues, Tim reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. Edwin Brock had tried to destroy Tim's family and had instead set in motion events that led to Tim's true calling, protecting other military families from the predators who targeted them. It wasn't the ending Tim had imagined when he first learned of May's betrayal, but it was the ending he'd earned through careful planning, methodical execution, and an unwillingness to let evil triumph over good. Timothy Fletcher had gone to war against domestic enemies and won. Now he got to live with the victory, surrounded by the people and principles he'd fought to protect. It was, he thought, a pretty good way to spend the rest of his life. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.